Coordinator at the Division of Public Health and Community Services here in Nashua. And we're really excited that you're here and having this conversation with us about race. It's such an opportune time to have this conversation with everything that's going on nationally, but it's also important to have the conversation because it's Juneteenth. So I think it's a very appropriate day to have this conversation. I'm gonna hand it over to Desi, and she will introduce our guest for today. Desi, you can take it over.
Thank you, Lisa. And thank you, Dr. Nicole Brathwaite, for being with us today. We're so fortunate to have you and your expertise in guiding this conversation for so many of us. And so to introduce our wonderful speaker, Dr. Nicole Brathwaite is a nationally recognized and board certified adult, child, and adolescent psychiatrist. She is the CEO and founder of Well Mind Psychiatry and Consulting Company, and she has expertise in perinatal, postpartum mental health, trauma-informed care, telepsychiatry, mental health in communities of color, school psychiatry, and implicit bias and racism in mental health. We're very fortunate to have you, and we look forward to everything that you have to share with us. So thank you again for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. And you said my name correctly, which is awesome.
We practiced beforehand. So we want to start with just a couple of questions. First of all, why is it so important to have a conversation about race and racism with our children at this time?
Sure. So, I mean, I think certainly now is a great time because kids are seeing so much on TV, social media, and ultimately kids are going to learn about race and racism. And it's always better if they can understand it and learn from it and hear from their parents first before hearing from a random person on social media or seeing about it in the news. And so obviously, you know, it's great if everything that kids learn, if it can start at home, particularly something as difficult as talking about race and racism. And so, you know, it's important to talk about for so many reasons. One, we certainly all want our children to be kind, understanding, and empathetic people. And helping our children to take the perspective or understanding of a different person with a different background can really help build that kindness and empathy.
I want to just go back for a second and invite everyone who's watching us live to please write in the comments any questions that you might have for Dr. Nicole so that we can continue this conversation and make it as worthwhile for you as possible. The next question we have is, how young should children be when we start to have these conversations about race and racism?
I get that question so often, and I would say as young as toddlerhood, so 2 or 3. My son's first experience with racism was when he was 3 years old. A young child told him that his brown skin was ugly and that his brown skin looked terrible with his red shoes. And he shouldn't wear those red sneakers because they look so ugly against his brown skin. And I'll never forget, he came home that afternoon and was just devastated. He was crying. He didn't understand why this child said these mean things to him, and he wouldn't wear those sneakers again. And I realized we had never talked about this with him. We had never had discussions with him about race or racism. And in that situation, he was the only Black child in that environment. And I realized that children, particularly children of color, experience racism in preschool. Even, you know, looking at the rates of expulsion and suspension from preschool, the majority of those students who are expelled are preschoolers or, you know, 3 or 4 years old. So, you know, I would say it certainly makes sense to start in preschool, one, because children begin to experience discrimination that early, but also because that's when kids are noticing their environment. And I'm sure every parent has experienced their kids saying, well, you know, is that lady pregnant? She has a big belly. Or, you know, why is their skin brown? And so often we're immediately shushing our kids. We don't want to be embarrassed. We don't want them to ask these questions, but we shouldn't shush them. We should encourage their curiosity and an inquiry because they're learning about their environment. And if we're able to share with them our understanding of race and racism and help them to appreciate differences and to appreciate what they're noticing about people, again, they'll grow up continuing to learn, to be interested in learning and understanding people from different backgrounds.
Definitely. And how do we have a conversation once things have happened with children of diverse backgrounds? So like you said, that experience happened with your child. I think we shouldn't wait for those experiences to occur before having those conversations. But if they have, how do you approach that?
Sure. So the first thing I always tell parents is to listen, because I think we often assume that kids don't know, or they don't have an understanding. And before providing an answer or before offering advice, we really should try to understand what our children, what their perspective is, what their understanding is, and what they're thinking. So if a child does unfortunately either witness or experience a racist act or an act that feels discriminatory, the first thing is to, how do you feel about this? What are your thoughts about it? Giving the child the space and room to just kind of express themselves. And before responding with advice, I always encourage parents to use a skill called reflective listening. So that's essentially listening to understand versus listening to respond. I think often when we're having conversations with people, we already have in the back of our heads what we want to say. So we're just waiting for them to finish so we can answer the question, but we may not be really listening to what they're saying. And kids and teenagers all the time will say, nobody listens to me, no one's paying attention. And in some ways that's true, because as parents, we already know that this is what's right and this is what we're thinking about, but reflective listening is kind of the opposite. So reflective listening requires that you summarize what someone's just told you. So if a child has a negative experience or they're hurting, give them the space and time to express their feelings, their pain, their thoughts, and then summarize what you've heard. So, explaining to a child or saying to a child, wow, so it sounds like when that happened or when that person said that thing to you, it really hurt you. And now you're wondering, is something wrong with you? Is that what you're trying to tell me? Is that what you're saying? And so one, the child feels heard. They know that you're listening. They know that you're present. They know that you're there with them. And two, you can also make sure that when you're responding, that you're responding to the right things and that you and the child are both on the same page. So that would be the first thing if a child experiences a negative event. And then the next thing, after ensuring that you're on the same page and everyone has an understanding, certainly validate that child. Often after kids are victims or if they're witnesses of something very scary or very hurtful, they may feel bad about themselves. They may feel terrible, particularly if kids witness an event like this and they didn't do anything or they didn't know what to do. So validating that child's feelings, encouraging them, supporting them. Certainly for children of color, confidence and belief in themselves is a major issue when they encounter racist events. So, again, being very specific with your encouragement and describing or explaining to the child what is great about them, what are their strengths, and remind them of things that they have been able to do if they start questioning themselves. And then the third part is education. And so explaining to kids what racism is, explaining to kids why certain people do these things, that, for some reason, some people don't respect other people or don't care about other people simply because something is different about them. Their color of their skin is different, or they come from a different country. And that's, a very sad thing that happens. But for some reason, some people just don't have that kindness in their heart. And so they can feel this hatred or this anger towards people, even though they don't know them.
Desi?
Well, I wanted to thank you so much, Dr. Nicole, for that explanation. And I wanted to kind of dive deeper into the education piece that you were just talking about, and was wondering if you could share the resources and tools that you've been able to use or that a lot of people have been able to use to help them through that, because I know as people, we're not perfect and we don't know everything. So
Sure. Yeah, definitely. And I mean, to your point, in order for parents to feel comfortable having this conversation and to feel prepared, we have to be educated first. And, you don't have to know everything. Parents, it's okay to say, I'm not sure, or it's okay if you have an older child to say, you know what, let's research this together. Let's figure this out together and have that be a project that you and your family embark on as a group. So certainly parents are not expected to know every answer, but it's helpful if you have done some research and you do have some of the tools and the language to help kids understand this. So a couple of different websites. On my website, wellmindsconsulting.com, I have a resources tab, and on that resources tab, I created a document with resources, with anti-racism resources and with resources to help families with children of color. So there are a ton of resources there, but other more specific resources I would recommend. One website is called teachingtolerance.org. And it's more specifically for educators, and it is in general about teaching tolerance, teaching respect, teaching about social justice. But there are a lot of really great resources that can be helpful for parents too. And it's really geared towards supporting adults and giving them the information to support children. Another website that is very helpful is Racial Equity Tools. And that's a really comprehensive website with a tremendous amount of resources and research, understanding disparities, understanding discrimination and racism. And then other websites like Sesame Street and PBS, you would be surprised, even the National Geographic, they all have really great articles about how to talk to your kids about racism and resources that are child friendly. I'm not sure, some people may have seen Sesame Street did a CNN talk. They had one about COVID and they also had one about racism. And, even that, Sesame Street, obviously, they've been doing this for a very long time. So they understand the language of kids. So, Sesame Street, PBS, National Geographic, teachingtolerance.org, Racial Equity Tools. And in terms of actually getting books with diverse characters or with Black characters, there's a website called blackbabybooks.com. And the entire website is dedicated to books with Black characters or written by Black authors. And so certainly for everyone, Black families, white families, families of different ethnicities, it's really important that your home is full of diverse reading, diverse toys, diverse dolls, so that representation is there, particularly for families who don't have opportunities to work with or see families of color very often. So you really have to have that representation at home. So blackbabybooks.com supplies a ton of books written by Black authors with Black characters.
We really wanted to take a deeper dive into one of the words that you said, which is anti-racism. Anti-racism. And I think there's a lot of misunderstanding of what that word means. If you can kind of give us a broader definition or just a little bit more information about what that means so that people have a better understanding of it.
Sure, yeah, it certainly can be confusing. So essentially, anti-racism is kind of going beyond just not being racist. So it's actually taking initiative. So often when people think of racism, they think of the aggressor. They think of someone doing something to hurt someone else. But what anti-racism emphasizes is that if you're the bystander and you're allowing injustice to occur, or you're aware of injustice and you're not doing anything about it, that's feeding into it. That's being complicit. And being anti-racist means being intentional in the other direction. So ensuring that you understand what racism is: systemic racism, structural racism, institutional racism, individual racism, that you're really making an effort to understand and educate yourself and your family about the structure of racism, how it came to be, and what it looks like. Also, that you're using your position and your privilege to try to reduce the impact and the effects of racism. So, some examples would be, you may have seen recently a lot of white influencers or Instagram influencers or really famous people are allowing or lending their social media accounts to Black activists. And so they're using their platform where they may have thousands of followers, and they're allowing or encouraging Black individuals, Black activists, to utilize that platform to educate the masses and to educate their followers. So that's an example of using your privilege and position to be anti-racist. Or teaching your kids about racism, teaching your kids how to stand up against racism. That's being intentional. And that's another example of being anti-racist. So anti-racist is more than just not doing something. It means that you're doing something to actually change our society and change the way that racism is impacting individuals.
Thank you for that. I think another question that comes up very often is the difference between racism and then microaggressions and how they impact people, even physically, mentally, socially. They really have a deep impact in people's lives. And I don't think we talk enough about microaggressions, but it's really an entrenched part of racism.
Sure, absolutely. That exactly what you described. So microaggressions are racism. And it's really hard because often the people perpetuating the microaggressions will tell you that I'm absolutely not racist. I don't have a racist bone in my body, but not understanding that some of their behaviors and some of their actions are discriminatory and as a result racist. So microaggressions are these kind of what seem like minor instances of discrimination or racism, but they're not obvious. So it's not like someone called you a racial slur or someone wrote something terrible on the bathroom wall. Microaggressions are more like someone, so they're, for example, there are two Black people working in an office and they always call you the other Black person's name. Or you're in an elevator and the individual kind of moves to the side or holds their bag. They don't say anything, but that physical reaction is clear that there's a bias there. Or, microaggression, there's been studies where they've presented the same exact resume to the same company. And one resume has a Black sounding name and one resume has a white sounding name. And consistently, the white sounding name is invited for an interview or given the job much more often than the Black sounding name. So again, that person will say that they're not racist, but their behavior is incredibly discriminatory and ends up having the same, sometimes an even worse impact on the person that's on the receiving end of that. And, actually microaggressions can often be more detrimental than some of the macroaggressions or more obvious forms of racism, because there's kind of this ambiguity to microaggressions. Like there's always room that someone can say, oh, I was just joking, or, oh, you take things too seriously. And so it leaves the victim feeling unsure. It leaves them questioning themselves. It leaves them feeling frustrated. And then there are certainly even environmental microaggressions. And so when I work with schools, this is something that I really emphasize. When a child of color walks into your school and they look at the books, they look at the pictures on the wall, does anything resemble them? Can they see themselves in any of the pictures or posters? Can they see themselves in any of the staff or teachers? And the books that you assign, are there any images or stories about strong characters of color? And so by not having any level of representation, that's a microaggression. Or the representation that you do have are negative stereotypes of people of color. And that kids internalize that, and that can be very harmful. And that in itself is a form of racism and is what we describe as microaggressions. But they're really not micro because they can actually be quite painful.
Thank you, Dr. Nicole. I wanted to kind of backtrack to something you had talked about earlier, like highlighting the usefulness of social media in this time with certain celebrities who are using their platform to highlight Black voices and this movement in general in this time. And I wanted to understand your take about what are maybe some mistakes that people might be making as they're trying to be allies in this movement.
Yeah, and it's hard because one part it's maybe frustrating for a lot of people because it seems like a large part of the population is just discovering racism. And for some of us that have lived it or people who have more awareness, it can be challenging when people are suddenly wanting to learn about it, or it feels like, it's the most popular hashtag or it's the thing to talk about. And so, one mistake that allies can make is one, demanding or pushing your friends or colleagues of color to teach you. And that a lot of people of color, particularly African Americans or Black people, are exhausted. This has been a really challenging few months for multiple reasons. COVID is disproportionately impacting people of color, so that in itself has been very traumatic. A number of people of color have lost friends, they've lost family, and they're grieving the issues that come with economic loss and COVID. And so that was already challenging. We were already dealing with that. And so, I call it the two pandemics. There was COVID and now there's racism. And so the same people who were being disproportionately impacted by COVID are now the same people who are being really impacted by videos of police brutality and memories of racism in their own lives. And so when allies reach out to their friends and say, teach me, that's an imposition, because you're not fully understanding the pain that they may be experiencing. And right now, there are tremendous resources online for understanding how to be anti-racist and how to be a good ally. I mean, literally, if you Google how to be anti-racist, dozens of videos and articles. And so it's not necessary to push your colleagues or friends to teach you when you can teach yourself. And the other thing I think sometimes white allies may do that's a mistake is not listening, or assuming that they know what people need. So there's this term white savior, where there's this, some white individuals may feel this motivation to help, and they're so excited to help, and they want to just go in and save, but they're not necessarily listening to what their friends or the community actually needs, and they may make some incorrect assumptions about what's needed or what would be helpful.
Thank you so much for that. I wanted to ask more about like health disparities and how racism has affected that. I know that you have done a lot of work with postpartum and women of color, and I know that the word just like went out of my head, but a mortality rate for women of color is higher. And it has been directly linked to racism or the experience of racism in this country. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because I think it's so impactful if we're losing women of color just during childbirth. We need to do better with that.
Sure. And even thinking about how this is integrated with talking to kids about racism, it's important to understand that racism exists on so many levels. And so, there's that individual racism if a child experiences something or someone says something or an individual does something, but then there's also a larger systemic racism. And a part of the systemic racism is what leads to these disparities in numbers for women of color, particularly Black women. And so what we realize is that racism is traumatic. Racism is traumatic for a child, racism is traumatic for a teenager or an adult. And what's found is that the trauma of racism, it actually builds upon itself. So it's cumulative. So when a child experiences racism or is discriminated against in the classroom setting, that's traumatic. That leads to something called toxic stress. And toxic stress is like this persistent elevation in stress hormones and blood pressure and heart rate. And that's great if it's for a short period of time and you need to run or save your life. That's not great if you're sitting in a classroom or you're walking down the street and these things keep happening. And so what ends up developing is chronic inflammation. So toxic stress or chronic racism can lead to chronic inflammation. Chronic inflammation can lead to chronic disease. Chronic disease, including preterm labor, increased risk of dying early, heart disease, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, obesity, also things that put people at increased risk for dying from COVID. And there have been direct connections to the amount of racism that a person experiences and their risk for having psychological and medical problems. And so when we're thinking about how to have this conversation with our family or with our kids, understanding that racism is more than what we see. Racism is kind of what this country was built on. So there's certain things that were done intentionally to discriminate against certain populations. So like segregation of schools, even though it's technically outlawed, there are many cities and states where there's a very clear line between schools that have primarily white children and schools that have primarily Black children. And more often than not, the schools that have Black or brown children tend to have less funding, or the taxes in that area are less, so the school has less resources. And that was done very intentionally. What we call projects, or, large areas where many, many people are living close together, which also increases the risk for COVID, that was also done intentionally. And so when we're thinking about racism, thinking about the individual and also understanding kind of what this country did and how things were built that led to these disparities. And so when women become pregnant, they've built up all of these traumatic experiences from racism, whether it's a microaggression or something more overt, or living in an area where there's a food desert, meaning like there's no supermarket or access to healthy foods, or there's no access to public transportation, or finding a job is really difficult, or having a quality education, accessing that is very difficult, or exposure to disproportionate targeting by police is stressful. And so all of these things lead African American women to have potential complications. But also, when African American women are pregnant and have kids, it's found that doctors don't often believe them. So when a Black woman says that they're in pain, or that they're concerned, there's been a lot of studies showing that, unfortunately, a lot of medical professionals don't understand or aren't able or willing to really hear what Black women have to say.
That's like really hard to hear, but I'm hoping that this will be the start of a conversation in our community to improve those communications between patients and doctors. I just want to go back to something you said about education, and I'm wondering if you can talk to us a little bit about how we can support children of color in advocating for themselves in schools. There's a lot of microaggressions that happen in schools, sometimes from teachers, in saying things like, why don't you skip the honors class and go to this class because it'll be easier for you? And I've heard that so many times, and had to advocate for those students because I know they can do the work, and it makes them feel like they can't or they're less than. How can we help advocate for kids more in those situations?
Yeah, and it's so challenging, and everything that you're describing is supported by research. So evidence shows that kids of color, even when they display a lot of intelligence, or their academics are very strong, or they're on par with their white peers, that they're less likely to be referred for gifted programs, or they're maybe discouraged from applying to Ivy League schools. Black and brown children make up 60 to 70% of children referred to law enforcement. Black boys are 3 times as likely to be expelled or suspended when they commit the exact same problem or have the exact same behavior as their white peers. And white children are more often more likely to be referred to treatment and get support, and Black children are more often to be referred for discipline, and often harsher disciplinary practices. And a lot of children, particularly if they're children in a majority environment and they're in the minority group, a lot of children will say they feel like they're targeted, or they feel like they're not treated fairly. And unfortunately, that actually may be true, because a lot of studies have shown that teachers carry implicit bias, and that implicit bias can be connected to the rates of suspension and expulsions in their classroom, or even the grades. And when kids feel like they're not appreciated or feel like they're not supported, it affects their matriculation, it affects their trajectory. We know that when kids are expelled or suspended, they're more likely to be shuffled into the school to prison pipeline. And so there's so many significant risk factors if kids don't feel supported in school. So in terms of helping these kids, one, it would be to educate the school, and to educate the teachers, the principal, the superintendent, and really explain implicit bias to them. Ask them to look at their numbers. So, how many kids get suspended and how many kids get expelled, and what's the demographic breakdown? And really trying as hard as possible to encourage the school to really be open to understanding and recognizing that racism, again, is traumatic. And I'm sure the last thing that any teacher wants to do is hurt a child. But by not acknowledging your implicit bias and continuing it, you're hurting that child. So other things we can do is educating parents. and letting parents know that there are these risk factors that bias can occur. And if you can educate parents to help the parents also advocate for their child, that can be helpful. But, and again, it's allowing kids to feel like they have a voice. And so, certainly talking to the teacher, but also, if the kid feels like they need to speak to the vice principal or the principal or a school counselor, giving them that internal fortitude and strength to know that they do have a voice and their voice does matter, and encouraging them to use that voice to advocate for themselves. But still, it's very difficult. It's definitely a challenge.
Thank you for that, Dr. Nicole. And there was a question from the Facebook Live chat that somebody was hoping that you could talk more about what you kind of touched upon now, this idea of needing to advocate for yourself, but also struggling with the idea of internalized racism when it's these traumatic incidents of discrimination. So could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, no, it's definitely challenging. So internalized racism is essentially you're assuming the negative stereotypes, or you're relating to or internalizing the negative stereotypes that may exist about your race or ethnicity. And you begin to treat yourself or treat others who look like you in a way that an aggressor or someone who exhibited racist tendencies may treat you. And what ends up happening, what we see in communities of color, so there's colorism, and that's essentially where people who resemble European more, or have lighter skin or more European characteristics, are deemed prettier or better or smarter, and people with darker skin or darker characteristics, they have a negative connotation associated with them. And so that's certainly present in the Black community, that's present in actually a lot of countries, that's present in India and Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico and Latin America. So there are a lot of countries where they have people of color where colorism is a big issue. And so what ends up happening is, unfortunately, this self-hate. And so kids end up doubting themselves. They begin to believe the negative things that people tell them. So if someone tells them, well, you're never going to do anything good, they believe they're never going to do anything good. And then they start to behave that way. So they stop trying in school, or they start behaving the way that people assume that they would behave, and they start adopting those stereotypes. And it's quite harmful, because people end up living up to the stereotypes that people have about them, and they end up not living up to their potential. And so it's so important to really reinforce the positivity and reinforce the strengths for children of color, because it's so easy to internalize the negative stereotypes that exist about children of color, because it's everywhere. Those, more often than not, when you watch TV, people of color are not portrayed in a positive light. And so it's very hard for kids not to begin to internalize those things.
Thank you for that. I was wondering, how can we help support families of color, refugees that come from, African countries, to better feel at home in our communities? I think that's a big part, especially having this conversation here in New Hampshire. It's really important, because people of color are such a small part of the population here.
Yeah, I think that in the same way that we talked about in the beginning is educating ourselves. So asking questions, learning about where people are from, understanding their cultural background, understanding where they came from, the certain traditions that they may have, and then also, again, building empathy in children. And so empathy is being able to take someone else's perspective and being able to hurt when someone else hurts, or feel joy when someone else feels joy, and recognizing that it can be really difficult to move to a new country, a new city, a new state, and have to try to figure out the culture and get used to the environment and the school, and thinking about how difficult it may be for that individual. And if we're able to help kids build empathy, they'll think, if that were me, if I were in this situation, how would I want to be treated? Or what would I want to happen for me? And, really, if you can strengthen empathy, then that changes your behavior, because you take the perspective, well, if that were me, I certainly wouldn't want to be by myself. eating lunch. Or if that were me, I certainly would want someone to say hello to me, or to ask my name, or to ask how I'm doing. And so really welcoming individuals that come from different countries, because it's probably scary, particularly for kids. English may or may not be their first language. The culture, the format of school may be completely different. And so these kids really need support and need friends. And so, one of the first things, one is community outreach. So understanding them, inviting them in, supporting them, and then also ensuring that the environment is welcome. So again, if there are places where you do have kids of color or kids who have immigrated from certain countries, why not invite teachers to have a book written by an author from that country, or have a movie that the kids watch with a topic from that country? And they're really, if you do enough research, you can certainly find those opportunities. And so there are ways to make kids feel like they're a part of the environment and that they are included.
Thank you again. And as we're talking about the different ways that I guess children are better equipped to advocate for themselves and kind of fight against the internalized prejudices that other people are instilling on them, I think there can also be confusion from a lot of different sides about what's appropriate to do and say to people in this time. And I know there has been a question about the language that should be used to people individually when mainstream media, mainstream artists are I guess, perpetuating language use that certain people should not be using. So I'm wondering if you could speak to that.
So I'm assuming you mean like on like TV or movies or in music, where like what would be considered a racial slur if someone else said it? Why is it allowed? So that is such a difficult that's such a difficult topic. And depending on who you talk to, you may get a different answer. So some people feel very strongly that, so for example, the N-word should never be used by anybody. So there's so much history and there's so much pain behind that word that it should not be used ever. Other people will say that that word has been assumed by the Black community and kind of changed a little bit. So there's, the ER version of the word, and then there's like kind of like the shortened version of the word that's often used in music. And so, people will say that the Black community has taken that word and changed it to, it can mean friend, it can mean foe, it can mean brother. And so we have tried to change the way history or the way we see that word so that it's not as harmful. And so that we've used it and taken our power back. And so that's why it would be okay for Black artists to use that word, because they're taking that power back. They're taking the pain out of that word and shifting it and making it something that's meaningful for us. My personal opinion is I never like to hear the word. It's certainly, even when it is changed, for some people, it still has a lot of pain. I always think about my grandmother. She lived through segregation. And I remember my mother even told me when she was 8 years old, she was beaten for using a whites only bathroom. And so that when I think about the history of my family and we talk about it, that word carries a lot of meaning. And so for me personally, I would never encourage my children to use that word. And, if they were to hear it, to certainly educate them about it. But again, depending on who you ask, they may say, like, this is our word. We now take ownership of this word, which is why we can use it, but you can't use it, because depending on who says it, it may have a different meaning.
Thank you for fielding that question, because I know it is a difficult one to answer.
Yeah. And again, like, you can ask 10 different people and you might get 10 different answers.
So I wanted to ask a question about the work that you do with schools. What does that look like in the different schools that you've worked in?
Sure. So it really varies. I do a lot of education, and one thing that I have kind of been emphasizing to schools, I won't do a one and done. So oftentimes schools will say, well, come and fix racism, or come and teach us about racism and get rid of it, and then we'll feel so much better about ourselves. And I always tell people it's been 400 years for this to get to this point. So 2 hours will not get rid of it. And it really cannot just be a checkbox. So if we're committed to understanding and changing racism, then it has to be as much a part of education and professional development as math and science, or, you know, reading and language arts. And so the work that I do with schools usually starts with some form of education, because again, just making sure that we're all on the same page. So I usually ask schools to survey their teachers. What do you want to know? What questions do you have about racism? Certainly in an anonymous way, because there may be some things people want to know and they're too afraid to ask. And, you know, there's so much fear about talking about race and saying the wrong thing, or, you know, misunderstanding or misrepresenting what you're trying to say. So I certainly give teachers and parents and educators an opportunity to just, whatever you want to ask, whatever conversation you want to have, please let me know. So that's the first thing. And in general, kind of what I was talking about with white allies, you always want to know what the community needs before providing it, because I can assume I know what the school needs, but that may not be the case. And some schools are dealing with overt racism and some schools are not. And so certainly kind of doing a survey and getting an understanding of what the culture of the school is like and what they need. And then once I have that understanding, doing education. So teaching schools and educators about implicit bias, helping them understand some of the numbers that we talked about in terms of the disproportionate rates of suspension and expulsion, that racism is trauma. And again, a lot of people don't know that. They don't recognize that there's that connection, that racism is a form of trauma. It's a traumatic experience, and understanding when a child is traumatized, what that looks like. And then once we have a series of webinars and lectures and conversations, some schools will have situations that they like to talk about. So like case consultations. And so we'll, you know, if there was a situation that happened and a child felt insulted, or a teacher or a parent felt hurt, so we'll kind of have a conversation and brainstorm how to move forward or how things could have been done differently. And then, you know, some schools will kind of come in and work with the school around creating a strategic plan. So if you really want anti-racism to be a part of your curriculum, what does that look like for teachers and what does that look like for kids? And so we have to look at what exists and how we can integrate it and change it. And so my recommendation is never like one lecture a year, but it's more so, you know, when you're having meetings, how can racism be integrated into these existing meetings? Because it is always a part of the conversation, even if we don't say it.
I think one of the things that happens when children experience racism is that trust is gone with whatever system that occurred with. So in the school system, that trust with the school system is gone. So what can schools do to prepare to repair that trust with that child or with that community of children? Because it doesn't just affect that one child. Other children see that and their trust also is eroded with those experiences.
Absolutely. And that's a great point. And when a child experiences a traumatic experience like racism, they are not sure who to trust. And they may feel afraid, they may feel more on edge. And so it may seem like they're more irritable. It may seem like that they're responding, or they're, you know, responding out of proportion. And what they don't realize is that there's fear, there's hurt, there's anger. And so the child may be responding to a number of things. So, you know, again, one thing would be going back to reflective listening. So the school needs to be willing to hear the hurt. And the teacher, the parents, the educators need to be willing to be uncomfortable. And in general, when talking about racism, you have to be willing to be uncomfortable, because often with growth comes some level of discomfort. And if you're not willing to sit through that discomfort, you're not really willing to learn, and you won't be able to learn. So first, it would be listening to the child, listening to their anger, listening to their pain, hearing from their parents, and accepting that something happened where this child felt hurt, and accepting responsibility for that. And so the first thing would be listening and allowing that child to express themselves. The next thing would be to sit with the family and talk about a plan for how this can be addressed. So often, you know, if a racial slur is used or something is written in the bathroom, they wash it off, but then that's it. Like there's nothing else that happens. And so there needs to be more than that. So obviously this is an issue in our school, and if it happened this one time, it's going to happen again. So we have to come up with a plan on how to address it, whether that's educating the student body, whether that's having individual conversations with classes, whether that's supporting the students of color so that they have a place where they can go where they feel safe, or affinity groups in schools. And so, letting the parents or the child know we take this seriously and we are going to take tangible steps to rectify this. So hopefully it doesn't happen again. And hopefully with that, the child will be able to develop trust. And one of the best things that adults can do is to develop a loving, trusting, and supportive relationship with a child. And so when we look at research, the one thing that makes the biggest difference for children who have experienced trauma is having a dedicated, loving relationship with an adult. And so if a child has been hurt, it's really important that the child or the school identify an adult who can be their person, who is like, when they're having a hard day, that's the person that they go to. And that's the person that can provide them with unconditional love and support.
Thank you again. So I'm wondering if, this is kind of me making an assumption, but with your company, the Well Minds and Psychiatry and Consulting Company, how has this translated into your work? Because I feel like you're very much so speaking from like a lot of experience that you've had.
Yeah, well, I've been busy. It's definitely, things have definitely picked up. Again, I don't know if it was like the perfect storm. So COVID happened, so everyone's home and they're bored. And then all of these tragedies occurred. And this isn't the first time that these tragedies have occurred, but something was different. So because people were home and they weren't distracted by everyday life, or they weren't, able to hang out or, not pay attention, that suddenly there's this outrage that's occurred and people are just like, oh my gosh, like what, this has been happening. And so I've definitely been busier, and I'm hoping it's not a fad. I'm hoping that the interest in becoming anti-racist and the interest in changing laws that are racist or that discriminate against people of color, I'm hoping that this momentum continues. But even prior to this, I feel incredibly committed to doing the work and reducing implicit bias and reducing disparities. And ultimately, working with children is my passion. And so if there's anything I can do to minimize the pain that children experience and increase the love that they feel, then that's what I want to do. Fortunately, more people are recognizing the pain that racism causes, and ideally that we'll be able to kind of spread this message more and help children of color even more. And frankly, all children, because it's not just children of color who are hurt by racism. White children are hurt by racism too. Like every child is hurt, and every child benefits from having a diverse environment.
So you just talked a little bit about COVID and how this is a unique time in history. But I really hope that people take this opportunity to have a conversation with their kids. I think it's the best time because your kids can't go anywhere. So how can parents kind of prepare and just bring up that conversation with their kids while they have them at home?
Yeah, and it's tough because I'm sure it's almost like the sex conversation. No kid really wants to have it, but it's important conversation to have. And I would look at this in the same way when we talk to our kids about not talking to strangers. It's about safety. It's about support. When we talk to kids about looking both ways when they cross the street, these are necessary conversations for safety. And I see having this conversation about racism in the same way. We want our children to be good people. We want our children to love and care about other people. We want our children to respect others' differences and appreciate, and we want our children to be empathetic in the same way that we don't want our children going off with strangers. And so the safety and the importance is equal. So I would say with, depending on the age group, so like the little ones, while you're playing, on the floor with them, just, or even like, so younger children do really well through displacement, meaning like they can talk about things in their toys. So you can have, like when you guys are playing with your dolls or playing with trucks and, I wonder what would happen if this toy was mean to this toy just because that toy is a different color. How do you think that would feel? And so when you're engaging it in play, it's much easier for kids to have the conversation because it's not about them. And then it's like, well, they would say, well, that wouldn't be nice, or they shouldn't do that. And you guys can go back to playing and then bring it back again. And it shouldn't be one conversation. So this is kind of one, a lifetime of conversations, but you don't have to get everything done the first time you bring it up. And so beginning to introduce the conversation and engaging in play. With older kids, they're not on the floor playing with, trucks or dolls, but it's often easier for older kids to have these difficult conversations when they're doing other things. So if you're on a walk as a family, you can kind of have this conversation like, hey, I noticed on your social media, there was this post about George Floyd. Did you have a chance to read it? Or, what do you think about it? And it's, the kid doesn't have to look directly at you. They don't have to sit still and have the conversation. You're kind of walking, they can fidget a little bit, they can move. And so it just makes it a little bit easier to have. Teenagers, certainly they can have the direct conversation, but still it's always easier if it's, more relaxed. So like over dinner, and you guys are eating and just, like, hey, what are your thoughts about this? Or have you thought about it? I would love to hear your perspective. And again, often people don't ask kids for their opinions. And so when we tell children, like, I actually care about what you think and I value your opinion, and that's very meaningful. And so if you're able to emphasize to older kids, like, what you think about this and your perspective is important to me, and I would love to hear it. And then that just opens the door.
Thank you again. So another question now that's come up is this, what you've talked about here, your hopes that this moment doesn't just stay a moment, but the movement continues to go forward, and that people are willing to buy in to the work that needs to be done so that progress is made over time. And I think there's like an essential need to understand like fully the scope of what this movement entails. And so part of that, I think, is especially for non-people of color, for like white families, white parents, and their kids to understand how they're specifically affected by racism. I think it might be a little difficult at times to grasp if it's not something that they're like explicitly experiencing.
Sure. So, in terms of like why racism, specifically hurts white individuals, again, because it's very painful, and racism ends up causing significant discrepancies and disparities in our society. And, ultimately, when there are large groups of people who are disproportionately suffering, that ends up affecting the entire population. And that ends up changing, and even if we're thinking about like specifics, like economically, the fact that such a large percentage of Black women are more likely to die in pregnancy, I'm sorry. Oh, can you guys still hear me? Yeah. Sorry, my screen just went black. Sorry about that. I don't know what happened.
You're back.
Sorry about that. And so, again, so that affects a large portion of our population. And oftentimes people of color are the backbone of our population in terms of the essential workers. And sorry, did I go black again? Can you see me?
No, you're still here.
Oh, okay. I don't know what is going on with my technology is not my friend. But, so when certain large portions of our population are, disproportionately dying or disproportionately impacted, that affects us all. So, your teacher, your doctor, the delivery driver, the people that work in the grocery store, they're, many of them are at increased risk of dying. And so that affects everyone. But also, when you're witnessing other people suffer and when you're seeing other people in pain, that often hurts. And, children aren't born hating other people. Children, even as early as 3 to 6 months, recognize differences, but there's no meaning in that difference. And so when children witness racism or when children see other people being hurt or being harmed, that also hurts them. And if it's not explained to them, then they don't understand the meaning, and then they may end up going on and hurting other people, or internalizing that hatred. And, certainly harboring hatred is never healthy. And, harboring hatred is, can certainly cause its own issues and its own stress. And so, that alone is certainly a significant issue.
We're almost to the end of our time, but I want to ask just one last question. As a community, like, it's so important to have these conversations, but it's also so important for us to use appropriate language. Like, language is so important. We so often say, like, sticks and stones, but words won't hurt me. But that's not true. Words hurt. So how can we use our words to amplify, the voices of people who this is their time to have their voices heard?
Sure, and that's a great question. And so if you are in a position of power, if you are in a position where people listen to you, then this would be a great opportunity to tell other people's stories, or to even tell your own story. I'm from Philadelphia originally, and I realized over the last couple of days, there have been social media accounts popping up. I went to Villanova University for college, and I went to a school called Shipley for high school, and they're both predominantly white institutions. And there's an Instagram account called Black on the Main Line, which talks about the experience of kids of color when they attended private schools outside of Philadelphia. And there's an Instagram account called Black at Villanova that looks at experiences of Black students who attended Villanova. And when I read through those accounts, there's so much pain there, and there's just so much pain. And a lot of these stories have never been told before, or if they've been told, they weren't heard. And so if you can amplify those voices, or if you know that there are experiences, or if you know that there are other individuals in social media who are telling their stories or who are fighting for social justice, using your platform to amplify their voices, and using, if you are, a person of color in an environment where there aren't other people of color, hopefully taking this opportunity to teach individuals around you, and that it's a privilege to be in certain positions that we're in. And so utilizing that privilege. As a physician, I recognize that I have tremendous privilege that many other Black individuals, or in general, other individuals, don't have. So I take it as my responsibility to use my position to support and educate other people, and speak for people who may otherwise not have a voice. And so if you do have that, then certainly use it.
I want to say thank you so much to Dr. Nicole Christian Brathwaite, and to Adesi for accompanying me today and having this conversation. And like you said, it's not always a comfortable conversation, but it's definitely, I don't think there's any uncomfortable conversations that is not worth having. And this is definitely one that was worth having. Thank you so much. And I do hope that we can do this again. Maybe with more people from our education system, because I think that's where we can really start. When we start with the youth, I am so hopeful when I see so many youth using their voices, and really talking about their stories, and other children just coming together and really being open to learning more. And it just gives me hope for the future when I see so many young people being just so open. But I hope that we can make a difference, and I hope that this is just the beginning of more conversations.
Yeah, me too. Absolutely. And thank you.
I want to thank everyone for listening. And this will be obviously live on Facebook after this, but it's also available at Nashua TV in their educational channel. So you can watch it there as well. Thank you so much for being part of this conversation.
Thank you for having me.
Take care, everyone. Bye.
Good night.